Yo, everybody. Welcome to Off Panel, a weekly interview podcast about all things comics, brought to you by Sketch.com. I'm your host, David Harper, and this week's guest is the cartoonist behind my comic of the year, no one else. It's our Kikuo Johnson. Thanks for coming on, Kikuo.
Thank you so much. I'm so honored to be here.
I gotta say, I really would be honored to be where you are because I'm in Anchorage, Alaska, and it is 14 degrees, feels like -1, and you're in Maui. How was Maui today?
I'll say I'm not jealous. Maui, yeah, when I left, I spent most of the year in New York, and then a month in Providence and a month in Maui generally. And I was doing a little book tour earlier from New York to Seattle, San Francisco. And by the end of it, I was just like, I'm ready to be home. It's so cold. I was like, I left New York so long ago and it's still cold. Finally land on Maui. It's like, it's so nice to be here.
I imagine. I have to say, I was very envious. I guess envious of both of you simultaneously, but I know that you did a date in San Francisco with your old roommate, Paolo Rivera, which I think I would love to have been at that speaking engagement. That seemed like a lot of fun.
It was so much fun. So Paolo and I, we met in college. And we started college in 1999. And we lived together in college. We went on we studied abroad together. Then he came home and lived with me in Maui for a little bit. And then we spent 8 years living together in a loft apartment in Williamsburg, Brooklyn. So he's like a brother. And he's like one of my only friends that's also a cartoonist. So I feel like we talked so much about comics together and just kind of figured out our own styles and our careers like in parallel and talked about it together. And to be able to sit on in an event and just talk comics together and banter. It was really, really, really fun, especially since he moved to San Francisco. So it was also just a chance to catch up. Mm-hmm. I'm still in New York.
Have you ever taken reference for him?
100%. So, well, that was actually a little kind of joke at the end of my presentation in San Francisco where he wasn't expecting it, but I surprised him with a bunch of extremely embarrassing photos that I took of him to use as reference for my drawings. And then in fairness, I found some images that he used of me for even more embarrassing. I'm like Cyclops, from some X-Men comic he drew in 2005. But yeah, we kind of just figured out a lot of that stuff together in the early days.
Yeah, his wacky reference Wednesday stuff is always hilarious to me. What he comes up with to, bring his work to life is just always incredible. But enough of Paulo. This is not the Paulo podcast. I want to talk about your stuff. So going back to the beginning for you, I know you grew up in a rural part of Maui and you spent, it's funny reading about your experiences in Maui in a bizarre way. For some, this might not make sense. I feel like you might get it. It kind of reminded me of growing up in Alaska because, it's you were by yourself a lot. You were kind of exploring areas that people aren't really at a whole lot. And, you were drawing a ton. This reminds me a lot of my childhood, except for your drawings were probably considerably better than mine. I did want to talk about Maui's influence on you because obviously it's the setting of all three of your graphic novel releases and you're there now. So it's something that sticks with you. But, beyond the setting of all, how do you feel, being regularly immersed in nature and having that alone time affected how you kind of see the world, both as a person and as a storyteller?
Yeah, that's interesting. I think about that a lot, or I've been thinking about that a lot. Well, first, just to backtrack just a tiny bit. I have noticed that when I've met people from Alaska, there is some kind of kinship there. Besides just not being a contiguous state, there's such a huge influence of the native cultures in both places. Mm-hmm. They do feel like sister states in some way. And as you mentioned, I'm from Maui and grew up kind of in the country. So definitely a more rural upbringing than most of the people. When in New York, I'll meet people from Hawaii and they're almost all from Honolulu. In terms of how that influenced me, I'm not sure. I guess I do notice that growing up in a place like this, maybe same for you, I'm very used to seeing very far distances at a normal, on a normal day. And, now when I live in Brooklyn, I'll go for a week and only see down the block. And then if I make it to the river and then all of a sudden I'll see across the river, I have an emotional reaction to just seeing distance. And I guess that's relevant to my comics because I do notice that I am drawn to drawing landscape. I'm drawn to comics that often have a kind of immersive environment, specifically like natural settings. Like some of my favorite comics to come out in the last few years in America are like all the Garo reprints, that Drawn and Quarterly is putting out, the Tsuge reprints, specifically like are often like rural Japan, and that feels. I like stories that take place in those settings, like maybe because it feels familiar to me.
Mm-hmm. And it's like when you read it, it's almost like getting a little taste of home when the furthest view is like down the block. It probably is like, I don't know, it's probably comforting in some ways.
I think so. Yeah, Tsuge especially, and I don't know if you're a fan of those comics, but yeah, Drawn and Quarterly, or there was two reprints of the short stories from Garo, and then there was The Man with No Talent, that came out from New York Review Press, and I love those books so much. They're like weird and elliptical and just beautiful stories in kind of these rural settings. Yeah, just love them.
So I do want to go into, you went from living in, rural Maui, and I'm sure I'm yadaing a whole lot of stuff here, but
oh, that's fine.
You went from there to going to the Rhode Island School of Design and getting an illustration degree there, where you studied under David Mazzucchelli. And I do want to say, RISD is a enormously renowned school, but like the Mazzucchelli of it all is like absolutely astonishing to me, because I would say in my opinion, he's one of the greatest artists ever, or greatest comic artists ever. I think that's probably just widely considered to be a thing, but I know he was like a hero and an influence for you before you even got there. When you went there, did you know that you wanted to make comics? You didn't just want to do illustration?
Yes. Well, that's not necessarily true. So when I got to RISD, I actually applied as a graphic design student. They don't make you, it's not definitive, but they do ask you to have some major in mind when you apply. Mm-hmm. And I applied as a graphic design student, mostly because I'm from Maui and I didn't know any artists the two art careers that I saw were like, either you're like a landscape painter, essentially hawking individual objects to wealthy collectors, or you're a graphic designer. Like that was really kind of the idea of being a professional illustrator just never seemed like a real, that didn't seem like a real thing. Like who does that?
Yeah.
And so when I applied in graphic design. But very quickly, like kind of my classmates would point out to me like, oh, you're such an illustrator, just the way I would approach solving problems in all the different kind of foundation year classes. And by my the middle of my freshman year, I was like, I had this opportunity in a class where it's kind of an open assignment. I'm like, let me try to draw a comic, and kind of got back into telling stories. And I felt like I kind of got it out of my system. I was like, okay, there's my comic. I'm done. Next. And for the rest of like art school, I was really like kind of doubled down on, I wanted to be John Singer Sargent. I wanted to like paint realistic oil paintings. I think a lot of it is just like a competitive setting of art school where, I want to prove that I can like make a realistic looking painting, maybe even just a chip on my shoulder or something. Mm-hmm. But then by my junior year, I rediscovered comics. I fell back in love with comics, and I was like, no, the reason I like to draw, the thing I love about art is to use my imagination to tell stories. And it was right around the time when I read I Never Liked You by Chester Brown. And that book, like I had never read a comic that was kind of so honest and kind of literary and just hit me with such an emotional punch. Mm-hmm. And that I was like, I want to make comics. So junior year, I got back into it, started Night Fisher, which was my first graphic novel, started my junior year, and got about 60 pages in before ever taking a comics class. But I was aware that David was teaching the comics class at that time, and very much looking forward to that class as my senior year, the next year.
To bring it back to the Maui of it all, I do kind of wonder sometimes. So like growing up in Anchorage, like Anchorage is a big city. Well, big city relative to some places. But it also, when I was growing up, had a lot of like kind of wildness to it. Like I could like go into my backyard and all of a sudden I'm in like enough woods that I could get lost for hours. And I did, unfortunately, sometimes. When I was doing that, like me and my brother, for example, we would be walking around and we would just be making up stories as we go. And I do kind of wonder if like your roots, like, kind of running around doing your thing and like rural Maui and everything like that. I wonder if even then, like you were kind of like a storyteller, and it's like finding that Chester Brown book and like getting to that place where you take that class with David and everything like that, if you were almost kind of, this is very dramatic, I apologize, fulfilling like a destiny that you didn't even know existed already?
Uh, I like that story. I don't know. I will neither confirm nor deny, but that does ring true to me, at least in terms of like, yeah, we had like it was still, I kind of grew up in like there were still houses around, but like on one side of the house was a cow pasture that led to more woods.
Right.
And then on the other side of the house, it was like a horse pasture. And then beyond some kind of suburban area. And there was definitely woods to get lost in, as you say. I never ventured too far, but
That was a good idea.
And I and well, it's probably less life threatening in Maui than in Alaska.
Yeah.
Like, if you get lost in Maui, you'll be all right. But yeah, I like that idea. I certainly, yeah, definitely. Kids in the woods come up with stories for sure.
That is, yeah, for sure. I do like the idea too that you found a book or a comic that or like kind of changed your vision as to what kind of comics work. We're in the same like age group, but you probably grew up where it seemed like a lot of times it was like kind of superheroes or Archie or whatever, where like the main flavors you could get. It reminds me, before we started recording, I told you about how much I loved Brenna Thumler's Delicates. And she's a cartoonist who never really read comics and never had an affinity for comics until she was in college. And then she read Jillian and Mariko Tamaki's This One Summer. And it was just like, sometimes you find that work that just unlocks things for you and makes you realize like, oh, this is a thing I can do. This is a thing I want to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like that happened a few times. I think of comic readers our age. I know it happened for me a few times where, looking back, I'm not sure I ever liked superheroes or if that was the only flavor available. I always loved comics, but I'm not sure if I ever liked superheroes.
Sure.
I'm sure I did probably when I was about 8, but very, very quickly I was like, just not that into it, but I would still read that stuff because I like the drawings. I like the artists.
Yeah.
And then that like eventually felt like I'm just like, I don't want to read this stuff anymore. And then right around that time, stuff like Stray Bullets and Bone were coming out that allowed me to kind of pivot to something else, and then eventually give up that stuff. And then I find, the indie world, the Fantagraphics and all those kind of art comics and underground comics, and kind of fall back in love. But it's a really interesting phenomenon you bring up, where like kind of the generation of like just before us, I'm thinking of like the kind of first Fantagraphics generation, the Hernandez brothers, and just kind of the giants of comics literature that we think of. Like all those people grew up on like comics for kids and also, or adolescents or illiterates, however you want to frame it, and comics that a society that stigmatized comics as this like subliterate medium. And there's now like this whole generation, to your point, that is like coming up without that albatross. And that is super interesting to me. And I think like, I know an artist that I keep bringing up, and I may be unfairly defining him. I from what little I've read, this seems true, and I'm not sure if I'm even saying his name right, but Nick Dernasso is an artist that strikes me like that doesn't have all the baggage of like growing up, like thinking, like learning how to draw comics the Marvel way.
Right.
And I find that work extremely inspiring, and it gives, I feel like it's a lot of that work gives me permission to kind of shed some of the baggage that I've just kind of retained over the years. A lot of that stuff's good too, though. I don't want to shame, like, I'm grateful for kind of the comics that I grew up with, but they can be like a dead weight.
I think that the problem that people like, it's like if you put too much weight on any one type of comic, it's gonna like completely color your perspective to the point where it's like you said, it's like an albatross. It's like the only thing you see. I do think it's interesting though. So I know you're teaching at RISD now, like 1 month a year. You're going up there and you're like teaching like a new generation of comic, people who are interested in becoming comic creators in a comics course. And I find the current generation to be really fascinating because like they didn't necessarily grow up on superheroes. They grew up on the manga boom. They grew up on web comics. They grew up on Webtoon. They grew up with like Raina Telgemeier and Kazu Kibuishi. I imagine when you're teaching those students, you're seeing their perspective from a completely different filter than you or maybe even Nick Donasso came from. I don't even know how old Nick is.
He's young. He's too young to be that good. I don't remember how old he is, but yeah, there's not. I can't find that much information about him other than there's a great New Yorker kind of profile about him and what little and there's like a couple interviews here and there, but yeah. Let me finish. Let you finish your question, or
oh, no, that was it. I mean, I'm just basically. I imagine you're seeing. I mean, like it's probably interesting to see kind of what their vision is of comics because they came up in a time when there's so many more options beyond just superheroes. Everything was on the table. Like if you have a phone, you can pop on and read like basically an infinite amount of comics on Webtoon right now.
Yeah, it's awesome. I mean, it's really a good thing. I felt like it's like I think even when I was like took David's class, so this would have been 2003, maybe 2002. There still was a hint of like a defensive stance where it's like, hey, look, guys, comics can do anything, and which is kind of almost the thesis statement of like Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics.
Right.
But these kids, that argument has been litigated. These kids don't have that kind of chip on their shoulder at all, and it's really, really awesome to see. And I start every semester with every term with just interviewing them, trying to find out what they're reading, so I can like A, get a sense of where they're coming from, but also B, get some tips on like what are the comics that this current generation is growing up on. And to your point, it's a lot of webtoons and that stuff.
Are you like a young cartoonist energy vampire or something?
Oh, 100%. That's a really good way to think of it. I leech their youthful creativity and like use it for my own nefarious means for sure. Yeah.
I love it. Well, before we get into No One Else, I do want to talk about your editorial illustration career. I got to say, shouts to you to have like one of the most incredible trifectas of people to lean on throughout your career. You had Paulo Rivera as a roommate. You were taught by David Mazzucchelli, and you work with Francoise Mouly at The New Yorker. I mean, I don't know if you could ask for a better trio of that. I think if you had like Karen Berger as the fourth, that might be like the most renowned quartet you could ask for. But you're likely more known these days for your work as an editorial illustrator for a variety of clients, notably The New Yorker, like I said. I find this stuff to be really interesting. Like I just talked to an artist named Tula Lote who does a lot of, prints for like Mondo and does, illustration for like, I don't know, like Time Magazine and variant outlets like that. But she also does sequential comic art. And I always feel like as an outsider, like they're both still storytelling, but illustration is a wildly different variety of it than comics. Do you feel like those two types of work, like No One Else in your editorial illustration, come from similar parts of your brain, or are they just dramatically different for you?
I think that I do kind of subdivide the work that I do into categories, but the category that I would draw is like is art and design, and those words are kind of like I define those words for myself, and the way I think about those two words is, and everybody has a different definition, but my personal definition for like design work is that's my personal definition of artwork, I'll say, is like design work where I also design the content, whereas the design work is someone else is designing the content. So other than that, I think about them pretty much the same. It's just problem solving either way, and it's visual problem solving, it's visual storytelling. It's the same, but the big difference is, am I like decorating some article about like 401ks for a retirement magazine, or am I like pitching an idea that seems to capture the mood of New York City today for a cover of The New Yorker? So even though, say, the New Yorker covers are an illustration project, those tend to be more self-driven. And so I think of those as kind of part of my artwork. Whereas in the same issue, there might be like, I might do like a little, a same issue of The New Yorker that I did the cover for, there might be like a little illustration on the inside that's illustrating an article, and that feels like design work, right? So
it seems like there's a subdivision between like editorial illustration itself, where some it's just like execution of someone else's vision, where you try to bring yourself to it, but there's only so much you can do. And the other one where it's like you're actually pitching what your idea of this is. So you're kind of problem solving and storytelling to a more significant degree in that case.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's right. And I also I don't think of it as a hierarchy either. Of course, I'd rather be in control of the narrative, but the world needs good design. Like it's not I don't I'm not I think of it all as like good design, good art. Like I don't put one above the other.
And now, a quick word from one of off-panel sponsors. Macroverse is a next-generation digital comics platform, and one with an astonishing number of comics, with currently over 50 series from over 100 creators on their app, with a 5-star rating both on Apple and Google's app stores. Download the app and binge all their titles, including the Eisner-nominated Remind from Jason Brubaker, Lisa K. Weber's Hex 11, which has been described as Harry Potter meets Blade Runner, or the new queer supernatural adventure series Husk that launches on November 1st. It's just $4.99 a month to subscribe to Macroverse, with proceeds directly supporting the creators on the platform. Keep an eye on the future of Macroverse too, as 2022 is going to bring an epic upgrade that offers a new level of digital collectability and more, with early adopters able to sign up for more information at macroverse.com. And now, back to the show. Well, let's get into No One Else, the reason why you're here. My favorite comic of the year. Clearly, I love this comic because, it's my favorite. But I loved it both for your work and also, like, I feel like I have a very personal connection to this story for a number of reasons. But I'm going to go into a very abbreviated version of what it's about. It's about a family in Maui. Charlene, a mom who has been pushed to her limits. Robbie, her good times brother who struggles with his career as a musician and his relationship with his family. And Brandon, Charlene's young son, who in many ways, I don't know, he has to basically pick up the pieces for the family when this tragedy strikes to them. Also, Batman the cat, who we'll definitely get into later on, because right before this podcast, I actually had to evict 2 very unhappy cats. So I am like cat allegiant. So it's going to come up. It's in short, it's basically about family and how life carries on after tragedy. And obviously there's the Maui of it all, but I am interested in like where this story came from for you, because it feels like you really examining the idea of family and how families work, and that it's like, obviously each work you're going to do is a passion project to a degree, but this felt very, very personal. Like, what were the origins of No One Else for you?
This one it is a fiction, but it does feel super personal. It actually all started like maybe 10, 20 years ago. I don't remember, sitting at my kitchen table with Paula Rivera, by the way, and another friend was visiting, and she was just telling a story about her friend and how her grandfather's ashes came home and they ended up underneath the sink with all the cleaning products, and then later they buried the ashes in the backyard. And she was just kind of telling us the story as how like crazy and absurd it was. And she told the story, and I thought it was funny, it was sad, it was weird, and I like found myself kind of just wondering like how did that happen, and wrote a short kind of fiction around that. And that was years ago, and I kind of just put it aside. And I do that often. I'll write like the seeds of like a story or something that seems like it could be like a graphic novel later on. And for whatever reason, that story kept coming. I kept coming back to it. I kept coming back to it over the years, and just kind of mulling over it in my head, walking, taking a shower or whatever. And eventually kind of set it all in Maui, set it among the sugarcane fields. And it really came to life the minute I kind of had a setting for it, very familiar area that I grew up in. And so that was kind of the seed of the story. And I think for a lot of, it's like almost a cliche to say that like a lot of times, authors or artists, they're working on this project and they're just compelled to do it, but they don't even know what it's really about, what they're sorting out or whatever. Processing, I think, would be the psychological term that you hear thrown around. And over the process of working on it, I just found myself, of course, thinking a lot about, my own grandparents and the 4 grandparents that I had in over 30 years, kind of losing each one individually. And the kind of ways that I think for everyone in their family, like those deaths, each death kind of reshuffles every other relationship in a family, between a parent and a child, or extended family members, and sometimes it's a really small shuffle, sometimes it's a really big shuffle. But after those events, like they all kind of reshuffle. And I think I spent a lot of time while working on this book thinking about that in my own life, and just trying to put that into a comic. It just seemed just like the original story. It seemed to have both kind of sadness, but also humor. It just kind of all had all the elements that I like in art. I tend to like art that my favorite art is when a piece of art can make me feel two conflicting emotions at the same time.
Yeah.
Yeah, and if it can do that, then like it's like a drug that it's like a adrenaline. It's like, why is this fake thing making me feel such an intense confusion? And that I love that experience of music or film or literature, and that story seemed to have maybe potential of some of that.
I will say, in terms of conflicting emotions, the ending of the book, bizarrely, I read it in the bath the first time, and I let out like this sound that I could only describe as like laugh scream. It was it was like I was so shocked, but I was also laughing at the same time that my wife actually came and asked me what was wrong with me, and I was just like, I don't even know how to explain this, but something just happened in this. And anyways, I don't want to get into spoilers for the ending because it must be experienced, but I do think it's interesting, like the idea that this started with a singular image, like an idea, like that under the sink, like with all this other stuff, there's these ashes, and there's something like tragicomedy about that, where you can kind of build it out in both directions and then personalize it. I think that's really smart as a starting point. But one thing I really loved about the book is, I'm going to get real with you for a second. I apologize. This is an unusual amount of realness. But when I was younger, I mentioned my brother. He actually passed away when I was 13. He was only 15 years old. And it was obviously a very tough time for my family. And it was really, or I've read a lot of stories and watched a lot of stories about situations like that. And it's very rare where I feel like they kind of capture just how seismic like the reorientation of relationships and like responsibilities in a family can be when something like that happens. And that was one of the things that really kind of astonished me about No One Else is like you completely nailed it. Like you completely like the way that people react is it's like they can almost become a completely different person, and they can become, their responsibilities can shift completely, because you can make an argument that the person who's taking care of everyone in this book is Brandon. And as a person who went through something like that, that's very much something that can happen. And I don't know. I told you I was going to compliment you a lot. I just want to say, good job on that. That's a very tough thing to nail, and you totally did.
Wow. I mean, thank you so much. Like I actually have chicken skin listening to you say that. So I don't know what else to say. But, I'm so glad that the book had that effect. I mean, that means a lot to me. Thank you.
Oh, no problem. No problem. But I do want to talk about its development, because I read that No One Else went through at least 30 fully sketched drafts and that you made many additional rounds of edits to the finished artwork until the week it was due. Now, I've never made a comic before, but that seems like a lot.
Yeah, that probably sounds, that's probably maybe a slight exaggeration, only in the sense that one of the things that I discovered working on this book, and I think I was probably talking about when I said that, was how working digitally really opened up a new door for me. Because Night Fisher came out 15 years ago, and then I had a kids book in between called The Shark King, and then but really this is my first kind of fully self-driven book in 15 years. And one of the reasons it took so long was there were actually quite a few fits and starts of other graphic novels in between. I have a tall stack of abandoned graphic novel project pages, like actual drawn on paper pages. And I think one of the reasons why those projects kept getting abandoned is that comics are so difficult to edit. And in some cases, like that's their strength. I think the kind of I love old newspaper comics. So Frank King or Charles Schultz, like these guys are like almost like jazz improv artists, like kind of each day coming up with the next thing and building a meandering narrative, an enormous meandering narrative that way. And that's definitely one way to make books. But the kind of fiction that I'm really drawn to tends to be a little bit tighter, tends to be a little bit have more narrative symmetry. And so I kept kind of getting locked in on these other graphic novel projects. But after 15 years of like doing a professional illustration where editing is just part of the deal, like that's like half of the fee. If you're a professional illustrator, half of the fee is the finished product, and the other half are all the sketches and revisions that you're doing, right? That's the real work of an illustrator, is revisions and sketching. And so just developing a digital process that was much more fluid. So those 30 drafts of No One Else, it was really more like I drew an incredibly loose draft just of the whole book, and then refined and refined and refined, and like turn like the Monet painting slowly coming into focus. But also, they did take there were some dramatic turns where the books took like major shifts, and that's where I would count the 30 would be like this whole scene gets cut and then this next scene gets added, and like so it was kind of like a fluid process, but I would rename it each time like a major shift would change, and I got up to about draft 30.
Yeah. So for an example of that, one scene that's not there that I absolutely love that it's not there is when Robbie the brother shows up and he finds out that, you know, this tragedy, you know, I'm not going to call it a spoiler because it happens like immediately pretty much, but the their father, Brandon's grandfather, dies in a tragic accident. The moment when he comes there and finds out that this happened is actually skipped through. It's like you find out that, you know, Robbie like asks about like, oh, do you have like dad chained up somewhere, basically? And then it jumps into him basically on the phone calling people to like tell them that this happened. And I don't know, when you're talking about the 30 drafts and it's pretty loose and stuff like that, did like that scene where maybe Charlene tells Robbie exist at some point? Like, is that like the type of thing you're like, I need to include this, I don't need to include this, et cetera, et cetera?
That's a very thoughtful question. Thank you. That scene, I don't think I ever drew that scene. I might have. I'd have to actually look back. I don't remember. But that scene I don't think I drew. But there are definitely a lot of moments like that in the book that did get cut, that I did draw. I'm like, I don't need this. I'm going to cut this.
Yeah.
And whole other kind of side stories that I was like, yeah, let's save it. Like, we don't need this. And also a lot of stuff that ended up kind of scenes, you know, last minute additions that I think make the book what it is. So, yeah.
I imagine living with it for a long time as you did. It's like the version of you that started this book might have had different priorities than the version that finished it. And so it's like you had to kind of shift because you had to match up to where your sensibilities were today.
Oh, that's interesting. That's actually really interesting. I think that's absolutely true. And you just solved a puzzle for me that I've been wondering about. You know, part of the book is it takes place in the sugarcane fields, and part of the impetus for making the book was that in 2016, the Hawaii's commercial sugarcane industry ended, and being from Maui, where like the whole island was covered in sugarcane, and we grew up with these massive fires that would burn the sugarcane. That's how they harvest the sugarcane. That was just such a part of everyday life, and kind of one of the impetuses for the book was like when they pulled the cord, and in 2016, this huge part of island life was just kind of gone. I found myself like mourning this thing that I didn't really care about. And that was kind of tied into the theme of my book. And so everything kind of tied together. But I've been also feeling kind of weird about it, because I was like, I'm here in Hawaii promoting this book. And I'm like, how much am I talking about Hawaii? And how much am I talking about this like crystallized version of Hawaii from the past? Right. This is that happened in 2016. And your question makes me realize like, maybe that's when you take on a long project like that, especially in comics, some people can do it. Like some people can draw. Real quick, back to Nick Dornaso. One of the things that's so amazing to me about the book Sabrina is that it was so prescient. Like, how do you make a 300-page graphic novel that is so timely? Like it took me 10 years to make that book. So
Right.
how do how do you make one that's timely? But anyway, back to your original question. Like, I guess in a way, I wonder if part of my solution has been to kind of look back a little bit and have this thing that's maybe resolved already, so that as the years go on and as I change, like this thing is kind of, you know, stuck in time.
I mean, it totally makes sense. Also, I do want to say that your mourning of something you never really cared about actually makes a lot of sense for me. This is a very weird thing to mourn, but here in Anchorage, a lot of like big box stores have like died, and so we just have these buildings that just sit around. And I always tell my wife I'm sad that the Sam's Club closed, because it's just this gigantic monolith building that has no purpose now, and it's kind of representative of a version of society that no longer exists. And I kind of feel like that's what you're getting at, where it's like your version of Sam's Club is sugarcane fields, which actually like makes a lot more sense than my one. But at the same time, it all gets kind of back to emotions tied to the shifting sands of time, if you will, to put it in a dramatic sense.
No, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. Like the again, to put it in a melodramatic sense, like the empty sands club is a reminder of our own deaths.
I don't know why I'm laughing about that, but yeah, it's accurate. It's accurate.
Yeah.
Okay, so you mentioned somebody earlier that I think is an interesting note. You mentioned Charles Schulz. And one of the things I think is really fascinating about No One Else is the structure. Okay, I'm going to go on a bit here, so I apologize if this is completely irrational. But some of the pages, like there's this one 6-panel sequence on one page where it's got like Live Aloha. There's a bumper sticker where Robbie goes off to Brandon about how frustrating he finds a lot of Hawaiian residents before you bring it full circle to like this hilarious beat in the final panel. That to me, like you could take that completely out of the book and it exists fine by itself. It feels like a comic strip. And sometimes it's interesting because despite the fact it is a sequential graphic novella, it almost feels like a collection of comic strips that no one knew existed before it was collected. Like, were comic strips like an influence for you in this book in some ways?
100%. Yeah. I'm really interested in the idea of like, just, I really wanted to make a book that was just like utterly accessible. Like, and not because I want to like get a wide market or something like that. It's just that like, comics, I just wanted to make a book that like people that have never read a comic before would just kind of engage with the story and like find a story that they enjoyed as a comic. Like my approach was really to kind of pull off any barrier to entry that comics do have for a lot of people that I could. Of course, it's impossible, but that's kind of the way I thought about it formally. And a lot of that was like reading Peanuts and maybe Peanuts readers of our age. I don't know if you had this experience, but as a kid, I mostly just read it in the Sunday paper. And the Charles Schulz, the Peanuts strips of the 90s are mostly like weird sight gags with like Snoopy and Woodstock that actually didn't make sense to me when I was little. And I was like, this comic is stupid.
Yeah.
But in the last 3 years or so, something happened where I guess I was just kind of digging through my old Bill Watterson, Calvin and Hobbes collections, and then also complete Peanuts. And something just really clicked with Peanuts. And really, it's the minimalism, I think, of Peanuts. Just how descriptive Schultz's lines are, for both emotionally, for background details. They are so incredibly descriptive, and it's like one mark. And that in terms of like taking away barriers to reading, like I just found that like they're so easy to read. They're so utterly readable, like Peanuts and Charles Schulz. And also that rhythm, Charles Schulz rhythm, in No One Else, there's probably more panels without words than there are with words.
Yeah.
And especially like a lot of Charles Schulz jokes, if you read just the daily strips, the 4-panel strips, like very, very frequently there's one panel without words. And it's fun to read those strips and try to imagine it without that silent panel. And when you do that, it's like the comic timing in those strips is so impeccable. And that kind of like just extremely sharp, extremely precise comic timing is something that I think comics do so well. It's a kind of like a specifically like a gag panel strip format does it so well in a way that other mediums can't quite capture humor in the same way. And that was definitely something I wanted to explore in No One Else.
I think you do a really good job with the silence throughout. Like one of my favorite pairs of pages is this one scene where Robbie finds Brandon because Brandon's run out. Brandon's trying to find Batman, his cat. And he finds him, and there's a number of things that I really appreciate about it. Like the silence that takes place on the second page where it's just showing the work that Brandon has done. The interesting thing is like you do a really good job of using silence both for comic timing, but also for kind of elevating what these people are going through. And I think that's it. Like you do two things I think are really smart. First off, the 6 panels on the right, but also you don't show Brandon's face as he takes on this task. Like you show part of his face from a profile, but besides that, it's like you just kind of feel what he's going through the actions, and like that makes it so much more intense. And I do have to say, it's just like, you know, it's not just silence. I feel like you use restraint really well, and I don't even know how restraint enters the work, but it's just it feels like there are a lot of different ways you could have approached some of these storytelling beats, but deciding to pull back instead of like selling it hard makes it hit a lot harder.
Thank you. Yeah. Yeah. Two things there. The first, I was thinking about restraint a lot, just in that, like, you know, when we're talking about the albatross of the comics that we grow up with, like part of that for me, and I specifically mentioned How to Draw Comics the Marvel Way, which no other kid in my elementary school got to read because I literally checks it out every week, like of my entire elementary school from the elementary school library. And I was obsessed with it. And I was like, you know, John Buscema's like, well, of course, a Dutch angle of Doctor Strange entering a door is better than him just entering the door normally, you know. But for a story where it's like Captain America beating up Hitler, like, yeah, do a Dutch angle, turn the corner, like, and make the fist in the foreground and all that. Of course, yes, it's a exterior conflict. That's what we're paying for. You know, we want to see the action. But for this story, you know, no one else is. Most of the conflict is interior, and on top of that, almost none of the, like, for the most part, nobody's actually saying what they're feeling or thinking. Like the dialogue is actually everyone's talking around the real issue. So the conflict is 100%. Or not 100%, but it's mostly just implied. And for a comic like that, the kind of Jack Kirby approach, or the Frank Miller approach of, like, you know, having Daredevil like reeling in pain on the ground, like, which is how I learned how to draw comics. Like that telling readers how to feel about it is not going to work. It's got to be the opposite. You've got to, and so I found a very restrained. I was looking at a lot of like Hergé and Tintin and stuff like that, where a more restrained kind of gridded and subtle approach just seemed to make more sense for an interior story like that. But if I may, real quickly about, thank you for citing that page of it was a page of almost non sequitur things that showed what Brandon had done, and it was kind of like the results of like him walking through town. You get to see, without giving a spoiler, you get to see what he did, like the results of his work throughout the town. It's a 6-panel grid. And that's actually from Schultz. So there's a strip. So early on in the strip, in the 50s, back when he had the weird cartoony round like brush head, right? He did a lot more kind of formal experimentation. Later on, it was mostly like talking heads and like by the 60s, he wasn't doing a lot of formal experimentation. But in the 50s, there's one strip in particular. And so the first panel, it's a 4-panel daily strip. And in the first panel, it's just a sidewalk. You just see the sidewalk, and there's some like junk on the floor, like a yo-yo and a penny or something. And then in the next panel, like, again, the same, the sidewalk, but you're down the street somewhere. The background has changed a little bit. And there's like a slingshot or something. And then in the next panel, it's just the sidewalk. So there's no figures in any of these. It's just the sidewalk with some stuff on the side, on the ground, different background. And then finally in the fourth panel, Charlie Brown has his hand in his pocket and he goes, "Oh, I must have a hole in my pocket." And so it's kind of a dumb joke, but the magic of that, and I think this is really unique to comics. The magic of that is that you read these 3 images, and then by the time you get to the 4th image, it changes the meaning of the 3 images before it. And because it's all there right in front of you, and it's not unlike a movie that's where the images disappear and replace themselves. all that stuff you just looked at, all those details on the ground, and they have completely different meaning. And that's a device that Nick Dornasso uses. And what it does is it creates comics that you really have to look at. Like, it's real to me. It's like it's not you have to look at these really, really simple drawings, and that's really unique. Most of the time, if you're doing as a designer, if you're designing a poster, you're making a simple drawing that can be read instantly, and you get it right away from a distance, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's the job if you're a book designer or anything, or if you're a painter. You're making, like, if you're Rembrandt, you're making a very, very complex image that you can stare at for hours because of its complexity. But Charles Schulz makes extremely simple drawings that you can stare at for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really interesting to me. That's unique to comics. And so thanks, Schulz. That guy's just a genius.
I think one thing that's fascinating that's come up in conversations with artists I've had over the years is that, like, it's almost like, for some, not universal, but some artists, like Chris Somney is an artist who's been on the podcast, who basically said that he's trying to, as he progresses throughout his career, to do his work with as few lines as possible and still have the same impact. And it kind of feels like, I mean, like, I'm not saying that, I mean, you're probably a much different person than when you made Night Fisher, but it's like, looking at the two, it just feels like with no one else, your line, it feels like you have a lot of confidence in the amount of marks you need to make to accomplish the same result, if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I completely empathize with Somney's angle there, where just try to do it in the fewest number of marks, and that, of course, is like a big appeal of Schulz for me. And I think part of that is that, just as a reader, as a kid, when I'm reading these comics, like, I'm seduced by the cool drawing. Jim Lee was my guy.
Oh yeah.
The more marks, the better, and it's very seductive. Like, beautiful drawing is really. I love looking at all drawing. Like, I love drawing. I love looking at, a map of someone's hand moving across a page. But I find, as a reading experience, a lot of times, if the point of telling stories, or the point of comics, is to kind of transcend the medium and basically have an experience where the reader is just totally immersed in the story, I just find, in my personal reading experience, like, the kind of minimalist approach tends to work better for that. I get lost in Charles Schulz's work. I think, as a cartoonist, like, there's very few comics that do that for me, where I actually forget that I'm looking at a page. Usually I'm trying to analyze, like, the panel layout or whatever. But the few times when I'm actually fully immersed, very often it's like very, very minimalist styles of art that do that for me.
Well, and I think the structure you had set up, like the format where it's like primarily 3x3 6-panel grid with like a horizontal format, it makes me think of comic strips, but it also makes me think of like Hark a Vagrant by Kate Beaton, where you like read that and there is like something to it where it's like there's a rhythmic nature to it, where and also like a simplicity to the storytelling that having that consistent structure gives you, that makes that you're trying to get this to as many readers as possible, not in a craven way, but in like you just want people to read it. And I think that helps a lot. I think having like that structure, because if you were doing like 22 panel pages where like wildly different sizes and then all of a sudden a splash page and all this stuff like that, people who had never read a comic before would be like, what the hell is this?
Yeah. And like, I mean, Ware figured it out, right? Chris Ware somehow, like, he makes these intricate, insane panel pages that that are still like very readable. Even, I think, I remember my dad, who doesn't read comics, picking up Rusty Brown and him being like, I don't know how to read this. And then, like, 30 pages later, it was, well, I like it, but it's just so damn depressing. So, but in a sense, like, that struck me as a victory for Chris, just in the sense that, like, my dad, like, as I was saying, my dad worked through any kind of formal barrier and was just reading the story at that point.
Yeah.
But to your point about, like, just a very, very simple rhythmic, like, I don't have the virtuoso Chris Ware ability. So like a very rigid kind of 6-panel grid, as a default, to kind of stretch out from occasionally, like, really, really helped me kind of get that rhythm, especially to your point about trying to get that kind of newspaper comic timing in, like, just kind of, a grid really, really fit.
And now, a quick word from one of off-panel sponsors. You may have heard of Bad Idea, the experimental comic book publisher that's rolling deep with titles from electric talents like Matt Kindt, Mark Russell, Marguerite Sauvage, and more, and doing it with oversized, ad-free, over-the-top releases you can only find at select comic shops around the world. There's no variants, trades, or digital versions either, so if you want one of their big Final 5 releases that are being released throughout the rest of 2021, make sure to visit badideacorp.com to find a comic shop near you or to pre-order a copy online. Do so soon because rumors are saying Bad Idea is over, so this might be your last shot. And now, back to the show. I gotta talk about the family because it's astonishing that it's taken me this long to bring them up. I just got lost in all this talk, but I think another thing that really helps with the universal nature of you accomplishing that, and the reason why I think it's probably very easy for people to connect with, but also to feel the emotions of, is I think there's a version of this story where Charlene is the bad guy. Where it's very clearly that people are just Charlene's not taking care of her kid and not dealing with her emotions and all stuff like that. But I feel like you did a very good job of each person has their thing that they need to hold on to. Brandon wants to find Batman. Charlene is trying to move on with her life and, get into med school. Robbie is taking responsibility that he previously avoided. Everyone's got their thing. Was it super important to you to balance each character's needs and arcs out with one another so it all comes together in the end where no one's a good guy, no one's a bad guy, they're all just getting through this together?
Yeah, the goal was how to kind of make them all empathetic at the very least. If not likable, at least you can kind of be well, I can see why they acted this way.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, that was certainly the goal starting out. And yeah, it's interesting. That was kind of the hardest part. And it's a short book. It's really a short story as much as it is like a graphic novel or a novella. And but yeah, it was important to me to kind of give all three characters are kind of a protagonist in a way,
mm-hmm.
and kind of have them each have their arc.
What is this Batman erasure? 3 characters? I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding.
Fair.
But I do think it's really, I love what you did with Charlene and Robbie because I feel like they're almost inversions of each other because Charlene feels all of the weight and responsibility. And then when the father passes, she is released from it. And then Robbie doesn't have any of it. And then he passes and he has all of the responsibility. And that's such a perfect counterbalance to each other. There I go again. I'm sorry. I'm just complimenting you. These aren't even questions. It's not useful.
Oh, well, I'm so grateful to hear your reading. I mean, I love that reading. And yeah, I mean, certainly it's funny because I wrote this book. Originally it was just a straight dark comedy. And every scene just seemed really funny to me. And then as I kind of leaned into it and worked over on the years and basically fell in love with these characters, and just started to empathize with these characters more and more, that I just played the jokes straighter and straighter and straighter to the point where I'm not sure half the jokes are funny at all. And it's just an event that happens. And that felt right to me. That felt better. And Robbie really was part of that. I think the weird reading of the book is that the first third of the book is not funny, but when Robbie comes in, he's kind of the comic relief, and I didn't plan it that way exactly, but I definitely wanted him to be counterbalance.
Yeah, I do think you definitely accomplished some level of humor because I did admit to scream laughing from a bathtub. So
okay, good. Okay, not everybody has that reaction. I'm so glad that you did.
Yeah, I read it again last night, and one of the things I think is interesting is this is another time where I'm reading too much into things possibly. Do you like parallels in your stories?
I'm not sure.
An example is this again, it could be me reading way too much into it, but there's 2 panels that I thought were really interesting on a reread. Was Brandon wakes up in the boat after the dad had passed away and the hospital had taken him away and everything like that. There's this one singular silent panel of birds flying away. And then when Brandon is found at the end, there's the final panel of that page is of a plane flying away. And then they're also both preceded by a close shot of someone's face, reacting to or, dealing with what's going on and everything like that. And then also the fact that the orange recurrence in front of the couch in the beginning and the end of the book. I'm not going to say anything. That sounds like nothing to people, but I think you probably get what I'm saying. It feels like there's parallels. Were you trying to parallel things from the beginning and the end of the book, or am I just reading way too much into this?
For sure, definitely, and parallels both narratively, but also like trying to draw attention to shapes. You know, the color is like used pretty judiciously, and the opening sequence where you first see kind of the title sequence, I did kind of hopefully wanted to kind of lull the reader into an experience of like, oh, I have to pay attention to these shapes.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you know, it starts with the title "No One Else" in a circle, then you flip the page and then it's a cheese ball. It's like the
Mm-hmm.
same exact circle in the same exact spot. And like, yeah, there's a few moments like that in the book. They're pretty subtle. I don't know if, I mean, I don't know if I'm just like playing with it just on my own to entertain myself. But yeah, there's a lot of that stuff in there, and it's not a key part of the reading experience, but it keeps me entertained.
And, you know, it is one of those things too that kind of adds value to rereads. Like, and it's not that I sit around and reread every single comic a bunch, but I will say like that's one of the things that has impressed me about it. I mean, obviously a number of things because I basically spent the last hour complimenting you, but I will say that when you read it the first time, it's like the emotions are very present and you have all this, but then when you read it again, it's like you start kind of like picking up on some of the depths. You know, a good thing, you know, a connecting tissue of all of this is I love your character acting. There's like two beats that I specifically noted, like the whoa 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 face from Robbie towards the end to the smile you give Brandon at the yard sale at the end. These are just like, the Robbie thing is big. Brandon's smile is very small, very simple. And I think that the only way you really connect readers to this story is through the characters and making people feel what they're feeling or understand what they're going through. Empathetic, as you put it. Like, what's the key to effective character acting for you?
That was definitely like a big difference with this book and like Night Fisher. Like in Night Fisher, like I did everything to like not draw the faces and not draw the character expressions, mostly because I just wasn't good enough at drawing, especially with a big clunky brush. It was not the best tool to get that precise character reactions.
Weren't you like 21 when you started on that too?
Yeah, I started at 21. I'm 40 years old now, and working on No One Else, the that was definitely a goal. Is like I want to like have these characters shine, and there are many kind of sequences where I just have the exact same composition, almost like an animation, and just repeat the same exact panel, but have the character kind of act and move in space, just to kind of bring them alive when I felt like the kind of scene dictated that. And yeah, I don't know if I have a tip or a secret about it, but just I definitely was thinking about that, and that was kind of a tool in my toolbox that I think I didn't have before. And after kind of 15 years of as an editorial illustrator, that's kind of become my bread and butter. Where you know, there's so many different types of editorial illustration. Some people do like, you know, the metaphor illustration, you know, or whatever. But kind of my niche has become like whimsical stories, slightly humorous, of like figures in space, like interacting a clear narrative is kind of what's become my bread and butter as an illustrator. And so a lot of that has been like, you know, the difference in gesture is kind of what will like tell the story a lot of times.
Yeah.
Is this person like laughing nervously or laughing happily, right? And so those are the kind of the things I had to kind of nail down in my illustration career. And I really wanted to try to bring that into a comic. So I'm glad that you feel like that's coming through.
It is interesting. There's overlap there, but I don't know if people would necessarily think of sequentials being influenced by, I guess, I mean, everything's going to influence you. Like the way you draw, like all the things you take on, it's going to make you understand what you want to bring into your comic work. But I will say, I mean, it's like one thing, you know, a very famous illustration you did was like the commencement cover for the New Yorker. And like the character acting on that is just like amazing, absolutely incredible. Like the face, the class of 2016 guy is giving the guy who's getting the caps out of the tree. That face is just, it speaks volumes. I also don't, I think it just speaks to the general terror that goes on with graduating from college and what all this means and everything like that. But it's interesting because you feel the emotions in a real way. Like I was actually talking to there's a comic critic named Oliver Sava who writes for the AV Club, and he I was talking to him about the fact I was going to have you on here, And he said that like he felt the emotion so much when he was reading the book, no one else, that he actually had to put the book down from time to time just because he was like, oh, I can't even deal with this right now. And I think a lot of it
Wow.
comes from the character work because, you know, it's like you really you do a very good job of putting people, you like being able to see themselves in these characters even if you're not like those characters, and it's done through your character acting.
Awesome. Yeah, I hope that's the case. I like that. Yeah, I did. When we're talking about drafting and revisions and stuff, I did find very often like what I would do is I would take these drafts and I'd give them to my friends to read, and I'd have them read it back to me. So I was like watching like a screening of a film as they like read it back to me.
Like they're performing
and
it?
became well, they would be like, okay, so here, so they'd read the dialogue, they'd perform the dialogue, and then they'd say, we'd both be looking at the book together, and they'd be like, and what I'm getting from this is that Brandon is sitting in the car and he's looking out, and I'd be like, well, how's he feeling? And he'd tell me like, well, he's feeling this. And if that wasn't what I was going for, then I'm like, okay, I've got to work on that expression, or I've got to like find a different way to show this. So Paulo was one of my first readers.
Oh,
And yeah, and so it was great. It was just, and you know, but sometimes, you know, people who never have read a comic are the best readers because they'll give you just an objective opinion.
mm-hmm.
But Paulo was really helpful as well. And sometimes, I mean, you mentioned earlier, like sometimes the best thing is to show the face, and a lot of times, a lot of the edits are like, well, let me turn this person around, so you're just looking at their back.
Yeah.
You know, like sometimes that allows you to kind of become the looking at the back of a character. Maybe sometimes is more likely that person will become an avatar.
Yeah, I mean, like also at the end when they're at the yard sale and you don't show Brandon's eyes, you just show his smile. Like there's like such a contentness to that, and I think that's perfect. Also, again, we got to talk about Batman really quick. You absolutely nailed Batman. I don't know how you got a cat to do photo reference for you, but you absolutely nailed it. There's like two scenes that are really good, that stand out in particular. First, when Brandon has in the beginning when Brandon has Batman sitting underneath him and he just keeps reaching for the little mousey, and then also how Batman pushes Brandon's grandpa with his head. That was electric cat cartooning throughout. As a cat owner, that and the dingle dingle smooch smooch scene where Brandon is trying to like attract him while he's going pee is like, I don't know. It just, I really saw myself in there mostly because I am like an absolutely insane cat person at this point.
I never had pets growing up. I was never a pet guy. And then I was living with one girlfriend who we just kind of, this cat came into our life, and kicking and screaming, I eventually fell utterly in love with this cat, and I consider myself a cat guy. I like melt every time I see a cat on the street. It's embarrassing.
My God. Yeah, same here. I do have to ask, I mean, this is probably something we can't really get into, but I feel like the name Batman is extremely important to this book.
Yeah. Yeah.
Not in like you're a huge fan of the Caped Crusader or something like that, but it ultimately proves to be perfect for reasons I don't want to get into. Why was that the name you went with?
Well, so originally the name of the cat was Bert.
Okay.
And one reason I remember when I was naming that cat, I remember hearing Charles Schultz. I really am like just
you love Charles Schultz,
like praising Charles Schultz right now, but he really is my guy right now. And I remember listening to an interview with him, and he was talking about how Snoopy is actually a pointer. And if you look at the shape in the early comics, like Snoopy is clearly like he's shaped like a pointer. But when he was interviewed, he would say that Snoopy's and in the comic, he would say that Snoopy is a beagle because words that start with B are funny. And I was like, oh, come on, dude. And then when I started thinking about it, and I would encourage people to do this at home, like think of funny words, and a lot of them start with B. He's onto something here.
Bonk, boing.
Yeah.
Yeah. I
Right?
like this. I'm going to keep going with this later.
So Bert was like just like a funny name that made sense. And then as I was working on it, like the ending wasn't coming through the way I wanted to, and I was like, oh, like Batman, because it's the tuxedo cat, and you know, it looks like he has the cowl, and it was just perfect. It was just perfect. And there's one other detail. I'm not going to get into it, but not like it's so subtle that no one's picked up on it yet.
Okay,
no,
we got to talk about this after we stop recording because I got to know
okay.
this.
Yeah.
Okay, so I just have a couple more things. I do want to bring up the color. There's it's pretty, there's like a blue, black, white to it for the most part, But then on top of that, actually, it might just be really dark blue. But anyways, every once in a while there's orange as like an accent color, as a pop color, et cetera, et cetera. Why was that the color you wanted as like the variation in there, the one to make everything pop?
Yeah. So you're right. So the entire book is printed with 2 Pantones.
Mm.
I love print. I love print like design, and it's most of what I do for my career. And so I wanted the entire book printed in just those 2 colors. So it's a very, very dark blue and a very saturated orange. And part of it is just like I've talked to a few people that have the same reaction. Maybe you do too, but like there's something about really like printed bright colors that I just have a emotional, like almost like synesthesia reaction to.
Mm-hmm.
And like I'll be like walking down the street in New York and somebody will hand me like a flyer and it'll be like for a laundromat, but it's printed with like a fluorescent Pantone color. And I have like an emotional reaction to it. I'm like, oh, and it's like a punch. And one of the hardest colors to print in a normal CYMK process, you'll notice this if you pull out any book or any comic, is like a bright orange. Like that, like you can get a really good red with a CYMK process, but like there's no combination of like M magenta and Y yellow that gives you like a really bright tangerine orange. And there's a few other colors that are just outside of the CYMK gamut. And I've noticed that when I see those colors that aren't in the CYMK gamut on a book, it gives me that emotional punch. And when I figured out that the book was going to be set in Hawaii and around the sugarcane fields with all the fire, I just knew that like that bright orange was going to be like a key part of just the kind of emotional punch of the book, and tried to use it as like kind of a narrative symbol more than a tool to like render the space or a background. It's really kind of reserved for symbolic meaning and narrative as a narrative tool more than describing objects.
Also the occasional cheese ball.
Yes. Yes. But it all ties together too. I don't know. Yeah, it all does have a theme that ties it together, though. I might be stretching on that one. I don't know if anybody's reading it that way.
I got to talk to you about this stuff afterwards. No spoilers here, but I do have to say I'm not surprised to hear that you think about this stuff a lot, because I was surprised but not surprised that in the back of the book you were credited for the book design as well. Like it seems like, I mean, obviously the process of making No One Else was a long one, but it's like, if you're going to release something, you want it to look and feel the way you want it to look and feel. And that comes down to design as well, I imagine.
100%. Yeah. Like, and that's one amazing thing about Fantagraphics is they will kind of support my vision for the book if I have one. And I definitely had a vision for the book. I really wanted it to be in paperback. I cornered, Eric Reynolds at Fantagraphics is like amazing to work with and just the greatest guy on earth. And I kind of cornered him once. I was like, well, if it was up to you, would it be hardcover or softcover? And he's like, probably hardcover, but really it's all up to you, man. But I really wanted a softcover. It just seemed right for this book. As I mentioned, it is kind of like a short story. It doesn't feel like it deserved a kind of grandiose book treatment. But I also wanted to kind of lavish like a lot of design kind of components on it. So it's got those big French folds on the cover that unfold to reveal another Maui scene. And
also the sugar mill stuff in the back.
That's right. Yeah. I thought that it needed at least a little bit, a note somewhere for the uninitiated, but I didn't want that in the text of the book. In Night Fisher, I kind of designed that book. Like the protagonist like is from the mainland and he relocates to Maui. That's not my life, but that's the life of the character. And part of that was like I wanted to like give an avatar for like people from the mainland to try to like, I wanted to like, I felt like I was on a mission to explain stuff to people. And with No One Else, I just wanted to drop them into this world and not explain anything. So I got away with it a little bit on the inside cover. There's just that paragraph, just a little history about the sugarcane in case you were wondering. But within the text of the book, it's all just kind of like, if you know, you know, and if you don't, you don't.
Yeah. This is obviously a labor of love. It's something you worked on for a long time. It's something you changed a whole lot. It is interesting to think about this book through the prism of like your editorial illustration work, because I imagine having that as something you could always do as like kind of like your breadwinner projects. Did that allow you to make the comic you really wanted to make? Because, obviously, like sitting with a project for so long, if that was like what you were doing solely as your career, it might have been considerably more difficult.
Sure. Yeah. It helps me in two ways, kind of having those two outlets, or maybe three ways. Like one of them is just that like any itch I have to like show off or like flex drawing ability or something like that, I can get that out like doing like really like render something or make something really complicated or just kind of like flex. I can get that into my editorial illustration, and with like my this graphic novel, I mean if anything, I was more invested in the graphic novel by far. Like that, it has so much more love and care in the graphic novel, but I don't feel a pressure to like try to show off or prove myself. I'm just really focused on trying to tell the story, and I think like being able to scratch that itch in my other job is like really serves my comics. And then on another level, like to your point, just career wise, um, you know, over the years I've gotten a few offers from I've done a few projects, like comics type projects for money, whether it be advertising or I've gotten offers from the big two to do like small stuff. Nothing super exciting.
You did a Strange Tale story.
I did do, and that was enough. Like I had a great experience. I got to write a story about Alicia Masters, like the greatest character in Marvel Comics. But that was plenty.
Yeah.
But to your point, like the editorial illustration, it pays better. It's less drawing. It does kind of allow me to do both. But yeah, I would love to figure out a way to make comics a full-time job that if I could, I would just make comics all day, but haven't quite figured out that balance yet, just financially.
Oh yeah. I mean, it's tough, but to close, I do want to talk about comics' place in your life and in your career, because you love them. It clearly, like doing them is something you find very fulfilling in a way that's maybe not, well, maybe greater, but definitely different than the rest of your work. Night Fisher came out in, I think it was 2005. The Shark King came out in 2012. This came out in 2021. Do you feel like, I mean, those are notable gaps. I'm not that there's anything wrong with that, but I mean, do you feel like comics are always going to be something you'll come back to, even if it's maybe hard to predict when that might be?
I do think that, like in my mind, I never left. I'm always working on comics, but
right.
Obviously, like as they publish, they're pretty few and far between. I love the medium so much. There's nothing. The last 2 years I spent, it was COVID. I basically spent just drawing no one else, and they were literally two of the happiest years of my life. Like they was so creative. I've never felt more creatively satisfied. I'm with a wonderful partner, so like together we have like it was just a nice quarantine, aside from like all the tragedies that were happening.
Right.
But I'm not sure. I'm still looking for the. I can't promise anything. I'm still looking for the way to make it financially feasible. Doing this every year would not, like maybe a few years on, a few years off is the way to do it. But I'm not quite sure how to balance it all.
Well, and it also seems like your work thrives in an environment where you can kind of sit on ideas for a bit and kind of figure out what they really mean to you. Because it's like if you somehow just did this story when you originally were, told that story about Under the Sink where the ashes were, it would have been a wildly different book. I mean, I don't even know if it would be a book. It would just be like, oh, this is a funny, sad image. But like being able
Sure.
to sit on it for a while, like it allowed it to become what it needed to be for you, I think.
Absolutely. Like, yeah, the way I think about fiction specifically is like, yeah, writing is rewriting. And I'm not, I like, I'll put it this way. I really like kind of like comics straight from the id. I appreciate like kind of the improv, like even the month to month grind of like Silver Age, like mainstream comics. I don't read a lot of that stuff these days, but like there's something super admirable about, well, what could these guys do under those constraints? But the reality is like I don't find that work super rereadable. And
Sure.
the kind of work, the comics that I really like is the comics that I was just rereading Asterios Polyp, and that book. It's like you can reread how many times. Like I think I'll reread that book like every few years. It's just so dense, and every time I do, there's a new reward in it, and that's kind of the kind of comics that I'm drawn to.
You know, it's funny. My wife is an architect, and she doesn't read comics. And when we got together, I pitched her on reading Asterios Polyp. I'm like, it's about an architect. And you know what she said? She said that architects, the last thing that they want to do is read about more architects when they're done doing their work. And I was just like, whatever, it's a good comic. I thought it was a good sales point. But yeah, I mean, I do think that it's one of the fascinating things about deadlines and in all this stuff with comics is that, like, there's no way to do your best work when you're constantly under duress of deadlines. I mean, you're going to do the work that you can accomplish, and you're going to do what's required to get the work done. But it's just like, I mean, Mazzucchelli is like a perfect example of somebody who doesn't do a whole lot of comics, but every time one comes out, you're just like, this is the greatest possible version of this story. And
exactly,
I think there's a lot of merit to that.
Yeah. And as readers, we're lucky to also have a body of work from him where we get to see what he does in the improv month-to-month style. So, like, if you really want that, you can go back and read those Daredevils or whatever.
Oh, I do.
There you go.
I have his artist edition for Born Again right behind me.
Nice. There you go. So I stand corrected. That stuff is rereadable too.
That's true. Anyways, well, Kikuo, that is all I have for you. Thank you so much for coming on to talk about No One Else and your career and your art. And thank you for being pummeled by compliments from me for an hour and 15 minutes. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Oh my gosh, what an honor, David. Thank you so much. And yeah, it's just I'm excited to listen to your top 20, and because you haven't broadcast that yet, I think this will broadcast. And yeah, I'm just, it's such an honor and such a pleasure to talk to you, and thank you for ramble on about Charles Schultz for however long I've been talking about him.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Off Panel with cartoonist R. Kikuo Johnson. You can find him on Instagram at R_Kikuo_Johnson and his work in my comic of the year, No One Else. Love Off Panel and want to support it? Subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts today and give the show a rating or review while you're at it, but 5 stars only. You can also support the show by backing it on Patreon. Find the show at patreon.com/offpanel. And when you back it on there, you get early access to each week's podcast as well as weekly content and more. Want even more? Subscribe to my subscription comic site, Sketched, at sketch.com for long-form articles, interviews, and the rest of the site's content and its members-only forum. You can find Off Panel and Sketched on social media by liking it on Facebook at /Sketched. That's SKTCHD. Follow on Twitter and Instagram at @SketchComic or following me at @SliceFriedGold. Big thanks to all my existing patrons, including Patrick Coyle, Joshua Corlett, Isaac Oren, Scott Carpenter, Rent Narbs Studios Comics, Nicholas Palmieri, Capes and Tights Podcast, Klaus Van de Ven, Brian, Submit Industries, Raj Patel, Jack Mulqueen, Kyle, Carl Kerschel, Robert Masella, Elza Chartier, Luke Nakashoji, Elliot Metz, Dr. Lou, Scott Hazelwood, Scott Buwan, Michael Tunk, Canadian by Proxy, Johnny Cannon, Bradley Rader, Carl Troy, Brandon DePillis, Patrick Brower, Declan Shalvey, Dan Garino, Josh Williamson, Adam Freeman, Ben Wild, Brian Klein Q, SB, Nick Bennett, Daniel Whitfield, Susanna Polo, Reed Hinkley Barnes, Mario Tiambang, AbductedTheComic.com, Andrew Carita, Matt Mahoney, Charlie Chu, Stephen Hall, Pensacola Pop Comics, Kim Estlin, Philip Myra, Christian Shelton, Kenny Porter, Chris Pachalo, Torrin Grunbeck, Fuzz Bubbles, Christopher Todd, Transmitter Down, Waltz Comics and Books, Carl Mizell, Danny Ollie, Paul Salates, Akil Wilson, Alex Dimitriopoulos, Terry Dodson, Wesley Gibb, Sean Kirkham, Alistair Ross, Julio Anta, Brett A. Schmidt, Jason Goodmanson, Paul Reinwan, Vita Ayala, Tara Ferguson, Dave Slusher, WMQ Comics, Akil Kokachi, Sean Pinello, Ken Heidelman, Philip Seavey, Al Ewing, Ryan Alcock, David Kelly, Robert Wilson IV, Nick Polito, Brendan Fletcher, Jonathan Nilsson, Matthew Groom, Jason Massey, Adam Bogart, Matthew Taylor, Nick Patera, Jacob Sorelli, Ford Gilmore, David Baraldi, Nick Hall, Bjorn Basin, John Hendrick, Steve Anderson, Ian Maxfield, Cliff Chang, Colin McMahon, Chris Palmer, Scott McGovern, Nathan Fairbairn, Kat McKenzie, Adam Highfield, Fiona Staples, Mark Abnett, Michael Murphy, Michael Shirley, Tom Barnett, Jim Demonakos, Norbert, Nick Lowe, James Kaplan, and Mission Comic Star in San Francisco. You guys are all the best. A quick thanks to Upright T-Rex Music, who wrote and performed Off Panel's theme song just for the show. Check out their music on Spotify because it's completely delightful. Thanks for listening, and tune in next week for another episode.